I'm just looking at the time right now, and I do want to have a lot of time for discussion, so maybe I'll go ahead and kickstart this. I want to welcome everybody to our event. This is a School of Biological Sciences speaker seminars on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And we are just delighted to have Sara Brownell with us today. Before I introduce her, I just want to share a little bit about the seminar series for those of you who are joining us for the first time. This is a professional development series where we're hoping to equip instructors on how to have these qualities that we all want to have in our teaching, to have inclusive environments for our students. And we hope that this can be times wherein our trainees can really talk to an expert about some of these issues. So it'll be initially a seminar that's pretty typical, like you've seen before, where we have about an hour, but it could be as interactive as you want it to be, followed by 45 minutes more casual discussion section, where we really want to encourage our trainees to ask questions that they might have thought about along the way, or just even questions that weren't really touched upon by the main seminar series or seminar today. At the end of the series, students who attend 6 out of the 8 talks will be invited to complete a related assessment at the end of each of the talks they complete. And at the end, if they do complete 6 out of the 8 assessments, we'll give them a certificate of completion detailing their involvement, as well as their dedication to promoting excellence and inclusivity in STEM education. All of this was a speaker series that does require funding, so it helps us to know that you're here today. I'm going to put into the chat a Google form, and this is just an attendance sheet, kind of like you would have where if we're in person, there would be a clipboard that we pass around just to let us know that you're here. So if you can go ahead and go into that Google form and just type in your name, as well as just one question about what population of the UCI community you're coming from. So I will keep my introduction of Dr. Brownell short, but that's difficult because she's very accomplished. So she's currently a professor in the School of Life Sciences at the Arizona State University in Tempe. And she's also the director of the Research for Inclusive STEM Education Center, also at ASU. Her early work established the efficacy of course-based research experiences over the cookbook-style lab courses that many of us had when we were undergraduates. And more recently, her current research focuses on helping to make undergraduate biology education more inclusive, particularly for women, LGBTQ students, religious students, students with disabilities, and transfer students. Each of those populations she's really done a number of different studies on. And what's been really interesting is to see how she's done studies to help us really make inclusive environments for people with concealable, stigmatized identities, whether it's something like religious identity, sexual orientation, or something like depression. There are too many awards to name, but I will mention a couple of them. She has had national recognition for both her classroom teaching as well as her education research, including the National Association of Biology Teachers Biology Education Research Award, and also the American Physiology Society's Education Research Recognition Award. And just this month, she's been elected as a AAAS fellow for her work on societal impacts of science and engineering. So we are really excited to have her to help us create those really safe, inclusive environments at UCI. A fun fact that you might not have known about her is that she might be able to tell you a little bit about the therapeutic potential of small heat shock proteins in mouse models of multiple sclerosis and stroke. So that might be a hidden talent that you can ask her later on if you're interested in. But I'll keep my introduction short, and maybe if we could welcome her either with those Zoom claps or want to say welcome in the chat.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here, even though it's just virtual today. I'm really delighted to be invited to be a part of this, and it's so amazing that you all have taken time out of your busy schedules to do this. So the focus of my work primarily right now is looking at concealable stigmatized identities, specifically in the context of STEM and more specifically in biology. And today I'm going to focus in on one of those identities, the LGBTQ plus identity. So throughout the talk, I'll give you some opportunities to engage in the chat, and then we'll have some just open questions at the end. So to go ahead and get started. So in contrast to humanities or social sciences, STEM fields have been kind of notoriously unfriendly to LGBTQ individuals. They've been known for a lack of tolerance and acceptance. Some of this is because STEM is just assumed to be objective, that identity doesn't matter. And we see this not just with LGBTQ identity, but also thinking about race and ethnicity, thinking about gender. It's just, we do the science and it doesn't matter what people's identities are. But yet we know that that's not true, that the people who are doing the science, their identities are making decisions about what science to do, making interpretations about the science, et cetera. And so, but part of this presumed objectivity of STEM is thought to be why it's been less friendly to LGBTQ individuals. Studies that have looked at the experiences of LGBTQ folks in STEM report more negative experiences than in non-STEM fields. And specifically, out scientists often report that they feel pressured to kind of tone down their gayness or to basically make themselves appear more straight and cisgender in order to fit in science. There have been very few studies specifically on LGBTQ students at the undergraduate level, but work by Bryce Hughes has looked at LGBTQ students' persistence in college STEM majors, and they have found that Bryce has found that they're less likely to persist compared to their straight and cis peers. So the focus of my research group specifically on LGBTQ individuals in STEM basically takes the perspective of, we look at undergraduate student experiences, graduate students' experiences, and instructors and faculty. And we've done studies kind of with all three of these populations, looking at classroom environments, research environments, and the broader scientific community. And so today I'll tell you kind of a series of stories that involves undergrad students and instructors, although we do have ongoing work about grad students that I'm happy to share at the end of the talk. So a lot of us realize that at this point, in really the last 10 years or so, STEM courses are changing. There's been a huge push to move away from traditional lecture, where someone's standing at the front of the room just talking at you and students are passively absorbing the information, to what we call active learning. I like to use Scott Freeman's definition of active learning, which basically defines it as anything except for a 50-minute straight lecture. And this can involve some problem solving. It can involve, it often involves group work. It involves people kind of minds on, students constructively answering questions in the class. A key characteristic of active learning, not all active learning classrooms, but a lot of them, is that it increases interactions among students and between students and the instructor, right? We're often asking students to turn to their neighbor and solve some problem. We are, as instructors, calling on students in class. We may be going around and talking more one-on-one with students in class, as opposed to just standing at the front of the room and talking at them. And this is something that has really piqued the interest of my research group over the years, in thinking about how active learning presents potentially novel situations for students' social identities to become more relevant, right? And I have up here just kind of a smattering of social identities. Students come into the classroom with different social identities, and it could potentially influence their experiences in that class. And so we have ongoing work on a lot of these different social identities, but today we're going to focus specifically on LGBTQ plus students. So specifically, we are interested in how, if at all, do student LGBTQ plus identities affect their experiences in active learning, right? And maybe they don't affect them at all, right? And some of the prior literature would have indicated that, you know, LGBTQ identity, if STEM is this objective field, then LGBTQ identity wouldn't be relevant in these spaces. So before I actually show you the study of what we actually did, I want to get your minds in on this. I'd be hypocritical talking about some of the benefits of active learning without actually making you actively engage at some level. So how might active learning classrooms with increased interactions negatively affect LGBTQ plus students? So if you want to go ahead and just add some of your ideas to the chat. that'll help us all kind of get in this framework, even though we're all in slightly different spaces and not in the same common room. All right, go ahead and click them in if you haven't yet already. So other students may not want to interact to them. They might be rude. They might feel pressured to adjust to everyone around them in order to fit in. They might have anxiety about revealing their identity when you have to talk to people. It opens students up to potential peer bias. Okay, so great ideas. So keep those ideas in mind as I present what we actually did in this study. So we set out to document the experiences of LGBTQ students in active learning science classrooms. And we did this by recruiting from one upper level large enrollment active learning biology course at an R1 institution in the Southwest. We ended up getting 7 LGBTQ plus participants. And you might say at first, this is a really small number. What can you actually say about this? But given the size of the class, we actually, and the percentage of LGBTQ individuals at that particular time, we likely got every single LGBTQ student in the class. And we specifically wanted to do this because we wanted to minimize the variability of different settings and focus on how different students experience the same type of active learning in the same course. So we conducted a semi-structured interview study to see if their identities affect their experiences. I'm going to report out themes that we identified, and all the names that I'll present in this talk are pseudonyms to protect identities. So what did we actually find? So first off, we found that increased interaction among students in active learning increased the relevance of their LGBTQ identities, but students did not feel comfortable revealing this identity. So let's see some of the quotes that support this. So Josephine, who identifies as gay, says, "In traditional classes, a lot of people just show up and sit there. But before and after an active learning class, I feel like a lot more people talk with people around them. And I feel like that's because you form closer connections because you talk. You're required to." And then there can be these moments where you're basically confronted with a statement or a question that's either implying or questioning some sort of sexuality or gender construct that maybe doesn't apply to you or you disagree with. And then you have to make a decision like, what am I going to say? Many of these students echoed the same idea that in active learning, as opposed to traditional lecture, they could just sit there, they could be invisible, they didn't have to talk to anyone, they didn't have to worry about people judging their outfits, they didn't have to worry about people judging their hair, right? They could just kind of be invisible sitting there. But in active learning, they were generating more conversations, and often they would finish talking about a biology problem and then there would be extra time, and that extra time would force them into potentially lying, evading a question, right? Or coming out to someone that they would worry would not actually be tolerant or accepting of their identity. So Alan, who identifies as gay, talks about how specifically they were worried about actually coming out in class and being judged for their LGBTQ identity. So he says, "The risks of coming out that I usually see are other students view me as less of a person, or they view me as not even their equal, not intelligent, not their intellectual equal, and they don't want to work on projects or anything with me by virtue of being gay," right? To me, this quote is really powerful, right? That this combines the stigma of potentially of someone being gay as not actually being, as not being smart, right? And this is a reason why Alan wants to be perceived as intelligent in the class, so doesn't feel like he can actually reveal this identity. Further, sharing one's LGBTQ identity could be perceived of as inappropriate. So Margaret, who identifies as bisexual, says, "I mentioned that I was bisexual to show that this identity matters to me. And another student was like, we don't need to know your dirty secrets, and we don't need to know your personal life." That was the first time I was like, really? I can't even mention this? I don't think he used the word abnormal, but he said like atypical. Like, we don't need to know about people who fall outside of the norms. She was just sharing this identity because it was an identity that was important to her, just like someone's gender might be important to them, just like their race, ethnicity might be important to them. But because it has to do with her sexual orientation and that there's that emphasis on sexuality as part of this identity, it's considered a dirty little secret. Now, really interestingly, so active learning compared to traditional lecture seemed to increase the relevance of these identities and seemed to present many more opportunities potentially for a student to be forced to come out. And they didn't really feel comfortable doing it, but they did say that if they felt like they could reveal their identity and others responded positively, they thought that it could actually be beneficial. So Alan, who identifies as gay, says the benefit I can think of being out is working with other students regularly. It builds stronger friendships. Being out does make me feel closer to people. I feel like that leads to me having stronger debates or having more in-depth conversations. Past, I think A is the answer, and I think A is the answer too. I think friendships are important in the classroom to facilitate active learning. And I think a lot of us would agree with this, right? In a traditional lecture course, you don't necessarily have to be friends with the people you sit around, but I feel like in active learning, it helps improve the experience 100 times if you're friends with the people around you. And this probably resonates with a lot of us, right? And this, I think we can expand and think this isn't necessarily just true of LGBTQ students that may feel like they can't actually be authentic and form friendships. Think about any other student who's potentially minoritized or marginalized in the classroom. If they are struggling making those connections, and there's other students that are having an easier time making those connections, we may be inadvertently creating situations where some students are benefiting more for active learning than other students. Now, group work is a common feature of active learning, and group work in active learning presented situations for LGBTQ individuals to be uncomfortable, which can increase cognitive load. And this often had to do with how groups were formed and to what extent groups were actually changed throughout the semester. So almost all the students said that the very first day of class, they would come in and they would basically scan the room and try to find someone who looked like they could be accepting of their identity. Because they were like, if I get stuck working with that person the entire term, then I need to basically use stereotypes on how those people look as far as how they might be reflective of whether they'd be accepting of my identity. Changing groups was really problematic, specifically for the transgender students. So Alex, who identifies as transgender, and he was actually in the very early stages of transitioning, so often had people misgendering him, said, I like sticking with the people that I know just because they know how to address me with the right gender pronoun. Not switching groups also kind of saved me the trouble of having to put myself in another situation where I would try to have to correct people or sit there and have people who didn't know me keep misgendering me. The transgender students in our study kept talking about how they basically were presented in situations where, do I continue to talk about the biology content, or do I correct the fact that someone misgendered me again, or the instructor misgendered me, right? And so this extra cognitive load of having to think about the pronouns being used, and that's activating a bunch of feelings within the student about, okay, well, then am I not presenting masculine enough to be able to have, you know, gender pronouns that are male pronouns, right? And so it brings up a bunch of other stuff instead of actually having the student think about the biology content. To push this even further, thinking about this extra cognitive load that some of these students are experiencing, that students in majority privileged groups would not actually be experiencing, Mar, who also identifies as transgender, said this: even though I present in a way that makes me feel comfortable, my social anxiety unfortunately makes me take into account how other people see me. In discussion-based courses like active learning courses, I think it's rougher for my emotional state when I feel like I need to talk to people, but I feel uncomfortable doing that because I don't know what their perception of me is. I worry, do they like me? Do they think that I'm stupid? Am I trying too hard to let them know that I'm queer? Is that something that they're going to think is ridiculous? Are they one of those people that wants to know? And do I want those people to know? Just reading the quote exhausts me, right? And imagine sitting there as Mar, trying to learn complicated concepts in physiology, right? In biology courses. And yet all of this is happening inside their brain, thinking about how their identity is presented and how people are relating to their identity, right? Adding way more cognitive load onto the student than a student who's not experiencing this is going to have to feel. Now, we were really interested in whether students thought at all about potential LGBTQ role models in the class. And so students, something that came out of the study was that students said that they would feel more comfortable in a class where they knew that the instructor was a member of the LGBTQ community, but they worried about the negative impact of coming out on the instructor. So specifically, Florence, who identifies as asexual, says, I think I would feel more comfortable in a class if an instructor identified as asexual because it would be nice to know that someone feels the same way I do, which right now would be very rare. I've never been able to talk to someone who feels the same way I do, like ever. So it would be nice to talk to someone that feels the same way I do about people. Mar, who identifies as transgender, echoed this idea. I think I would feel more comfortable in a class where an instructor identified as queer because I can relate to them on a different level, not just on a student-teacher level. I think that if I think a professor might be queer and I see them as a queer person, then I can also see them seeing me as a queer person, right? That extra kind of layer of feeling authentic in the classroom because you can see yourself in someone that is in that position of power in the classroom. However, every student in our study worried about, so every student in our study would basically say, so first off, none of them had experienced an instructor coming out in one of their STEM classes. And so they were like, it would be amazing if an instructor did come out, but every one of them didn't think that the instructor should actually come out because they were worried about the negative implications of them coming out. So Josephine, who identifies as gay, says that's their personal life. You know what I mean? I don't feel like gay professors are obligated to say anything. I feel like a gay professor coming out to students could in a lot of situations just be kind of weird. Although when I think about it, I know a ton of my straight professors who are married or they have children. So she spotted this hypocrisy in how she viewed straight professors talking about their significant others and potentially gay professors talking about their significant others. But because of this kind of internalized homophobia about it, she just was worried about the potential negative implications for the gay professors. Margaret, who identifies as bisexual, says, you hear a lot of straight people talking about my wife or my husband. And I think if a gay male faculty member said, oh, my boyfriend or something, and people would be like, whoa, did he just say that? And it doesn't happen. I've never had it happen before. And then finally, Alan, who identifies as gay, says that's a big move, especially in a lecture style class with everyone who talks in biology, like, oh, don't take them. They're a homosexual or they're gay or they're lesbian, because I can see my peers doing that too. So this to us was probably the most compelling finding of the entire study, because we are like, we want these students to be able to bring their full selves to the classroom. We want them to be able to bring their identities fully into the classrooms. But if they're worried about an instructor revealing their LGBTQ identity and what will happen to them, how do we expect these students to be able to feel like they can be authentic if the person with the most power and the most privilege in the classroom, they're worried about the potential negative implications for them, right? So this made us really think about what are our LGBTQ instructors doing, right? And the fact that none of these students had an LGBTQ instructor come out, you know, are there ways in which we can help show these students that LGBTQ instructors in STEM can come out and there can be potential positive implications? So to summarize this part of the talk, active learning increases the interactions among students, which increase the relevance of their LGBTQ identities. Students were reluctant to share their identities because they didn't view biology classrooms as particularly welcome, but they thought that they could benefit if they could bring themselves authentically to the class. They thought that they would benefit from instructors coming out. None of them had known a STEM LGBTQ instructor that was out, and they worried about the negative implications. And so I want to highlight, this was just one qualitative study from one course at one institution conducted in 2015. And a lot has changed since 2015. We've done this talk at a lot of different institutions. We've done some subsequent studies with students, and there are some themes that certainly are still true today, and actually a surprising number of them are still true today, even though a lot has changed in terms of national legislation that makes it that basically provides more privileges for LGBTQ individuals. But I want to highlight that there could be institutional differences and geographic differences from this. So this whole study on students, that last point, thinking about instructors and whether instructors come out, and the fact that none of these students had had an LGBTQ STEM instructor coming out, that sparked our interest in doing a study specifically on LGBTQ instructors and to what extent do they come out in the classroom and what are their reasons why they come out or not. And so that led us to do the study, what factors influence college biology instructor decisions about revealing their LGBTQ identities in class. So we conducted a national survey of LGBTQ college biology instructors. We recruited using a bunch of different listservs of biology instructors, and we invited folks to basically answer questions about to what extent they're out. Are they out with their research lab? Are they out with their colleagues? Are they out with students in classes that they teach, et cetera? And at the end of the survey, we invited them to participate in a follow-up interview, and then we were able to interview a subset of folks. So here were our survey respondents. We actually got 60 people to respond to the survey. Majority identified as gay or lesbian, but we did have some representation kind of across the board. I do want to point out that almost all of the literature on LGBTQ individuals is lacking data for transgender individuals. So we were really fortunate in our first study that we had 2 transgender individuals, but there are likely significant other challenges for transgender individuals compared to cisgender individuals. So I want to call that out as a limitation to this work, but it's a limitation actually on almost all of the work on LGBTQ individuals. So we wanted to ask, to what extent are LGBTQ instructors out? So based on this survey, these 60 individuals, we found that 56.6% said that they were mostly out or completely out to their work colleagues. Now, we were mostly interested in what's happening in the classroom. So I want you to think to yourself, what percent of instructors do you think are out to students in their classes, either most of the time or all of the time? So go ahead and take about 5 seconds or so to think about what percentage you think might be. And then we're actually going to do what's called a chat blast. So basically I'm going to do a countdown and then you all will put your number in the chat at the same time. So, I'm going to do a countdown. So 3, 2, 1, go ahead and put your percentage in the chat. So 15%, 10%, 10 or less, 20%, 5, 10, 15. Okay, so it's about the same amount for folks. So you're close. So 18.3% said that they were completely out or mostly out to the undergraduates in the biology courses that they taught. So we thought that this was interesting, right? That people are far more comfortable being out to their colleagues in their departments than to their students, indicating that there's different factors maybe at play in terms of what they perceive as appropriate and what they perceive is comfortable for them to actually do. So we wanted to explore this further in the interview study. So we ended up interviewing 27 LGBTQ biology instructors. We did semi-structured interviews. I'm going to show some of the themes. And we explored specifically their perceptions of the costs and benefits associated with revealing their identity in front of their college biology classes. So we were very specific about what was happening in the context of these undergraduate biology classes. So what did we actually find? And I do want to call out here, we actually didn't have any of our transgender individuals who are willing to be interviewed. So all of this work is just specific to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer instructors. So that's why from here on out, it's going to be LGBTQ and no T in that. So they identified both costs and benefits associated with coming out to students in their biology courses. So what did they actually identify? So before I actually show you, again, I want you to go ahead and write your ideas in the chat to wrap your head around this. So what costs do you think instructors identified relating to revealing their LGBTQ identities in their college biology courses? Why might these instructors not reveal their identity? And just as soon as you jot down your ideas, you can go ahead and enter them in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing poor evaluations, loss of credibility, distraction from class content. Okay, yeah, really interesting ideas. And we had the same speculations going into it. And it echoed what some of those students who are worried about instructors coming out also thought. So what came out of this specifically from these individuals who were interviewed? So they thought that students would have a negative opinion about LGBTQ people and may develop a negative opinion of the instructor. So Dean, who identifies as gay, says, I would tell an instructor to decide whether to come out based on the students you have in your classroom, how well or not well you think that coming out will be perceived. If you don't do that, you aren't prepared for what might follow when you do come out. Some instructors talked about how they actually felt like they could lose their job. So Claire, who identifies as asexual and queer, says the atmosphere here at her particular institution is not supportive to anyone who's not straight. You better be cisgender, you better be straight to fit in here. If an instructor were to come out at my institution, they need to really think about the ramifications and the consequences because it could be really bad here. It's so conservative that I'm not joking when I say I'm pretty sure I could be fired. Now, as a caveat, Claire taught at a private Christian institution, and she literally could actually be fired. It was kind of in the contract in terms of what she needed to be able to stay employed there. And she would talk about actually having these almost like secret gatherings for LGBTQ students where they'd meet in her office and they would talk about things, but everyone had to be kind of hidden because of the atmosphere. And so this is probably more extreme than a lot of places, particularly a place like UCI, that's a public institution. But there are also ways in which things can be uncomfortable, right? And decisions can be made about hiring or firing of people that may be more indirectly associated with this. And this came out as a worry from a lot of the instructors. Also, there's the cost of time in class not spent on learning content. So Jeff, who identifies as gay, says, I'm not explicitly outing myself to my students just because I don't know how it's necessarily pertinent in the classroom setting. They didn't want to waste time on things that were not actually the biology content, right? And they didn't want it to be perceived of as taking time away from the student learning. Now I want to focus on what are the possible benefits. So again, I want to encourage you to write in the chat, what benefits do you think instructors identified relating to revealing their LGBTQ identities in their college biology courses? Again, go ahead and just write your ideas in the chat. All right, so we've got visibility for queer students. Breaking down power dynamics to increase relatability, making the instructor potentially more human, right? Bringing up kind of an identity of the instructor. Any more ideas? More authentic interactions, comfort, safety in the classroom, addressing negative, inaccurate representations or stereotypes, right? We all have kind of this potential like stereotype of someone who might be a member of the LGBTQ community, and maybe that instructor can break that stereotype by showing a different side of that. Okay, so really great ideas. So what were the benefits that these instructors actually came up with that they thought would actually be a benefit to revealing? That they're happier when they're living most authentically. So Corey, who identifies as gay, queer, and bisexual, says closeting yourself is not something that I take lightly because it's hard and it can cause damage to you, and I don't think that it's good, especially if you've already been out. Study upon study has shown that actually being closeted and keeping part of your identity secret and having to navigate who you tell the secret to and who you don't, it can have a huge like psychologically negative toll on individuals, right? So the instructors can actually be happier and potentially could teach better, right, if they are happier. The instructor could be an example of a member of the LGBTQ community to all students. So Lauren, who identifies as a lesbian, says it was important for me to have my students have someone in their life that they experience who they see as not only their biology professor, who is passionate about her job and good at her job, I think, but as someone who's living as a lesbian, and that they knew that it was just a normal thing to be doing. That it wasn't that you can be a biology professor and not be a member of the LGBTQ community, that you can have both of these identities at the same time. They also talked about how the instructor could become a known supporter of the LGBTQ community. So Matt, who identifies as gay, says, if I did come out, it would be as a way to let other people know that if they're gay or lesbian or transgender, or bisexual, whatever, that I'm their ally. And then echoing what someone said in the chat, students find their instructor more relatable. That's a possible benefit. So Dean, who identifies as gay, says, when I made coming out about the struggles that I face, it made a huge difference for my students. A lot of them assume, well, you probably just had the easiest life, and whatever you did, you just cruised through. You were 27 when you got your PhD, fancy schmancy. It made a difference to talk about the depression and anxiety I had when I was in the closet, right? And some there isn't any concrete data on this, but there have been some speculations that anyone potentially with a marginalized identity could potentially feel a greater closeness with an instructor if their instructor is also talking about their experiences with a marginalized identity. Students might feel more comfortable in class. So Stacy, who identifies as a lesbian, said, I had one student come up to me during the first week and she just said she felt safer in the classroom, right? And this was an LGBTQ student. Now, compared to instructors who are not out instructors actually tend to perceive fewer costs and greater value to coming out, which actually really surprised us. So we went into the study thinking that people were choosing to conceal their identity and not actually come out in the classroom because they were worried about the cost. But what we actually found was for most of these folks, they hadn't actually thought about the value of coming out. So most of them just assumed, yes, there'd be some cost. They didn't think about the value, and that often led to their decision. So this is kind of a schematic of all the instructors that we interviewed. And the first part is the cost of coming out, and the second part is reasons why coming out to students could potentially be valuable. And the shaded box indicates that an instructor has actually experienced that cost or benefit. And what's really interesting is a lot of them have experienced the potential benefits and why coming out to students is valuable. Very few of them have actually experienced the potential cost. So for a lot of them, it's the anticipated cost, or it's that worry of a potential cost, but none of them have actually lost their job for coming out. And none of them felt like they actually had a concrete example of a student having a negative opinion of LGBTQ instructors. It was that worry. But a lot of them, especially the ones that actually were coming out in the classroom, they had actually experienced what it feels like to mentor LGBTQ students. They felt like, they already experienced what it was like to feel more authentically. So this got us really thinking, instead of focusing on decreasing the costs, could we actually focus on why this could actually be beneficial to students? And could that be potentially a way to encourage more LGBTQ instructors to come out if they feel comfortable doing so? right? So most instructors who are not out to students perceived a low value and a low cost to coming out. And this is basically, it just seemed like instructors hadn't thought about the potential benefits of coming out in class before. So the interviewer said, do you think that coming out to your classroom would influence the students in your classes? And Steve, who identifies as gay, says, you know, I don't know. I haven't thought about it until your question. I think I do avoid coming out to students, and I hadn't really said that to myself before, right? So for many of these instructors who'd been teaching biology a long time, and they were all like, had strong identities of being members of the LGBTQ community enough so that they actually, right, chose to complete the survey and chose to do the interview, but some of them hadn't actually thought about what coming out to students in their class might actually do for students. And instructors admitted that once they considered how it might actually benefit students, that might actually influence them to come out. So the interviewer says, talk to me about whether you come out to any of your students in any of your classes. Matt, who identifies as gay, says, I don't. I make it a point to not say anything about my personal life. And then the interviewer goes on to say, if you knew that it would benefit students to come out in the classroom, do you think you would do it? And then Matt, who said he makes it a point not to say anything about his personal life, and these are all pseudonyms, says, yeah, I would. But it wouldn't benefit everyone, right? But if I knew it would help certain students, I might raise it in a way that was not alienating of any one student, right? And so in real time through these interviews, we were really excited to see that some of these instructors didn't have such huge costs and huge hurdles that was preventing them from potentially sharing this identity in the classroom, that it was actually because a lot of them hadn't even just thought about it, right? And that seems like it's something that again, we're not advocating for everyone to have to come out, right? And obviously it's a very personal decision, but if it's just a matter of thinking through what the benefits might be, then that is an easier hurdle to potentially get over for someone to come out than actually getting over the hurdle of potentially losing your job. So the takeaways from this section is LGBTQ instructors identify both costs and benefits associated with coming out to students in their biology courses. And not realizing the benefits was really what seemed to be holding most instructors back from revealing their identities in class. So that brings me to the third kind of story that I wanted to present today, and that is, well, what do we actually know about the impact of an instructor coming out on students in their classes? And before we did this study, there was zero in the literature. There have been no studies at all. So there have been some studies that have looked at coming out and the impact on course evaluations, and it's actually mixed. So there's one study that shows that when a gay man came out, he ended up having lower course evaluations, but a couple other studies were not able to replicate that. But no studies have actually looked at the impact on students itself. And the two studies that I just presented to you, they're all about perceptions of these LGBTQ instructors and perceptions of students who had actually never experienced an out STEM instructor. So we wanted to say, all right, how does an LGBTQ instructor coming out actually affect all students in the class? Going back to that one quote that was worried about, well, would I be alienating some students? Maybe it would benefit the LGBTQ students, but how would it affect other non-LGBTQ students in the class? So we decided to actually try to tackle this problem. So we had an LGBTQ instructor agree to reveal her identity at the beginning of the semester in her upper level biology course. And this was done at a research intensive institution in Arizona. And I think it's really important to consider Arizona is kind of middle of the road here. We're often considered kind of a purple state at this point. We rank relatively low on policies for LGBTQ equality, but the surrounding metro area around the university is considered one of the most LGBTQ friendly spots in the state. And then if you look at kind of national rankings, the institution is not considered particularly friendly or unfriendly to LGBTQ individuals. So likely in California, you're probably going to be more LGBTQ friendly. So keep that in mind as you think about the institutional context of this study. So how did we actually decide to do this? So we wanted the instructor to reveal their LGBTQ identity in the context of the class. And she did this by a single PowerPoint slide where she introduced just information about herself. So after she talked about kind of her degrees and her academic journey, she had one slide that presented kind of her favorite activity, which was hiking, her favorite food, which was Chipotle, mentioned that she was a proud member of the LGBTQ community, and then mentioned her favorite movie. So that was all she said about being a member of the LGBTQ community. It was all of 3 seconds, and then didn't mention her being a part of the LGBTQ community again for the rest of the semester. 8 weeks later, at the end of her teaching of the semester, we surveyed students and asked them if they remember the LGBTQ instructor revealing their identity. And if so, then asked a bunch of questions about how that actually might affect students. Because we wanted to do just the students who remembered this, because we wanted to only assess who was actually there in class and who remembered that event to look at the impact. So the student demographics in this study were 475 students. We did this across 2 different semesters of a little over 200 students in each semester. 15% of the students identify as LGBTQ+. I will say that from the time we did the initial study with LGBTQ students, the percentage of students who identify as LGBTQ has actually increased over the last 5 to 10 years. You know, this could be because of greater acceptance about actually being willing to come out as LGBTQ. So these mimic kind of national trends. Students most commonly identify as non-LGBTQ in the class: women, not religious, white, and 61% of our students identify as having a history of anxiety and depression. And we were thinking that potentially this could play a role, thinking about other concealable stigmatized identities, and I'll get to that a little bit more later on. So I want you to predict to yourself. Instructor revealed her LGBTQ identity in less than 5 seconds using that one PowerPoint slide, never mentioned it again. What % of students do you predict remembered her revealing this identity? So I want you to think to yourself at this point, and then I'm going to have you do a chat blast. So you can go ahead and put it in your chat, but don't push return yet. So what % of students do you predict remembered her revealing her identity? Okay, hopefully you have your numbers in there. So go ahead and do a chat blast at this point. 90%, 85, 60, 80, 70, 50. Okay, so some people are really optimistic. They think almost everyone remembered it. Some people think that not, half the class remembered it. If you think about most of the stuff that we say in class, students don't remember most of what we say, right? How many times do we have to repeat things, really important things, and they still don't remember, right? So, we went into this and we were like, all right, like, is 5 seconds going to be enough for someone to actually be able to remember, right? And we were skeptical. And if you think back to some of those LGBTQ instructors, they were worried about revealing their identity because they thought it would take too much time. So certainly 5 seconds is not very much time. That's not going to be taking time necessarily away from content, but is it enough to actually be salient enough for people to remember? Well, we found that actually over 90% of students remembered the instructor revealing her LGBTQ identity. So this was shocking to us that so many of the students remembered. And we don't know exactly, but we think it's because it's unusual, right? Because I think that if someone went in and revealed their straight identity, it maybe would be less remembered because, well, I mean, people don't necessarily do that because we just assume everyone is straight, right? But because this is something that is unusual, or the students don't typically have an instructor doing it, we think that might actually be one of the reasons that so many of the students were able to remember it. We also looked to see if there were differences across demographics in the class about whether they remembered it, and we actually didn't see any notable differences based on gender, LGBTQ status, race, ethnicity, or mental health. So then we took those individuals. How many people remember Chipotle? Yeah, we didn't ask about Chipotle. Although, interestingly, one of the students was heard like later on talking and was like, yeah, can you believe that the instructor likes Chipotle, right? Which is I don't know. I thought that was particularly interesting because you would think that they would be focusing on the LGBTQ identity, but some people were excited about the Chipotle identity. Okay, so then we basically said, okay, for all these 90% of students who remembered, then we want to ask them a bunch of questions about how it actually impacted them, right? And what we found was that 66% of those students said that it had a positive impact on them, 31% said it had no impact, and then 3% of students said it had a negative impact. And again, these are just the students who remembered the actual event happening. Now, why did students think that there was a positive impact? So we coded their open-ended responses, and some of them said it makes the instructor more human, right? It makes them more like a real person, that it brings up an aspect of who the instructor is, and that's a positive impact for them. That it fosters an inclusive class environment, that talking about any identity could potentially like make it so that any identity is more kind of included in the class. It helps normalize LGBTQ identities. And 13% of the students said, none of my instructors have come out in class before. And so this was a really positive thing because it was so unexpected. 31% said it had no impact on them. Why? Well, a lot of them said that it didn't change how she taught or my ability to learn. And so it kind of, for them, it just felt like a non-event that happened. 22% said, I don't judge people based on their LGBTQ identity. So it was fine that she revealed this identity, but it didn't necessarily affect me. And it certainly didn't make me think more negatively of her or negatively of the class. And then 6% interestingly said, it didn't affect me, but then they went on and actually said, but I think it actually was a good thing to do because it probably helped other students, particularly LGBTQ students. Now, 3% of the students said that it had a negative impact, and only 2 of those students wrote in the open-ended responses comments, and these were the 2 comments. One said it made me feel uncomfortable, and the second said it distracted from course material, right? And so I'd like to kind of push back a little bit on the it distracted from course material, since it was less than 5 seconds on the very first day of class, surrounded with also introductory materials, but these were the only 2 kind of negative impacts on students' course experiences. Now, we also wanted to look at how it affects other constructs. So we wanted to look at how the instructor revealing her LGBTQ identity increased instructor approachability, instructor-student connectedness, how connected that student feels with the instructor, student confidence in their ability to do science-based tasks, students belonging in the actual class, students belonging in science as a whole. And to do this, we ran regressions where we looked at different identities. So we looked at LGBTQ status, gender, religious identity, race, ethnicity, a history of anxiety and depression. And then because this was done over 2 different semesters, we also controlled for semester in case that had a difference. So what did we actually find? So most students found specific benefits of their instructor coming out during the class. So 71% agreed that coming out made their instructor feel more approachable. 77% agreed that it increased the instructor student connectedness. 53% agreed that it increased student confidence. 64% agreed that it increased their belonging in the actual class. 57% said that it increased their belonging in science more broadly. But you're probably wondering, okay, so that's overall. What groups of students do you actually think benefited the most from the LGBTQ instructor revealing her identity, right? We looked at religious identity, we looked at mental health, we looked at LGBTQ status, right? So go ahead and write in the chat your predictions as far as what groups do you think would benefit the most from this instructor revealing her LGBTQ identity. And go ahead and just write it in this time. We're not going to do one of the blasts. Mental health. So anyone marginalized or in the minority group, all equally. Okay, so those are interesting predictions. So going into this, we were like, who's going to benefit the most from the instructor revealing her LGBTQ identity? I'm surprised that no one wrote it in the chat. We thought LGBTQ students, right? Like in some ways, like we're doing this to increase the capability for role models and mentors specifically for LGBTQ students. But we had the secondary hypothesis that has been called out here, that anyone in a marginalized identity group maybe could also benefit more, right? So we can think about women versus men. We could think about people who have a history of mental health issues compared to none. We could think about anyone who identifies as a peer or a person historically excluded from science based on race ethnicity. So we had that as kind of a secondary hypothesis. So let's see what the data actually shows us. So some students did benefit disproportionately. So specifically LGBTQ students benefited more than other students. So here I'm showing these forest plots showing just instructor approachability. So to help navigate you to these plots is basically anything is significant if it doesn't cross this middle line, and anything to the right that's positive shows an increase in whatever the construct is, instructor approachability. Anything to the left or to the negative of the line would show a disproportionate decrease in approachability. So here, and we have these different colors looking at the different groups. So we looked at LGBTQ, women, Christian, Muslim, other religion, Asian students, peers, so persons excluded based on ethnicity or race. So that would include Black, Latinx, or Native American students, and history of anxiety and depression. So this is what we found for instructor approachability. LGBTQ students benefited more, and everyone else, it was not significantly different. When we looked at all of the outcomes, what we actually found were really similar patterns. So for the LGBTQ students, across the board, they benefited more on all of these outcomes. And that mirrored what our predictions were going to be, right? That like an LGBTQ instructor coming out is going to have a bigger impact on LGBTQ students because they finally feel visible in the classroom. Now, we saw for some of the outcomes, women disproportionately benefited compared to men. So specifically for class belonging, science belonging, and student confidence, we saw a significantly higher. This could be because the instructor also identified as a woman, so keep that in mind. Or it could also be, there's some literature that suggests that women more than men really prefer more personal interactions. And so maybe that instructor revealing and making themselves more human mattered more to women in the class than men. That's just a hypothesis at this point. For religious students, we actually saw a disproportionate negative effect for Christian students for some of the outcomes. I will say, so overall, they still showed positive, but when we're looking specifically at the experiences of atheist or non-religious students compared to Christians demonstrated disproportionately less belonging, confidence, connectedness, and approachability. And then really surprisingly, we didn't see anything for any of the race ethnicities or for the history of anxiety and depression, which we expected to see. Okay, so to kind of wrap up this final section for this section of the talk, to what extent do students agree with the statement? I think it is completely appropriate for STEM instructors to reveal that they're a member of the LGBTQ community. We wanted to, harkening back to those concerns from students and from instructors that maybe it's inappropriate to share this identity, we actually asked these students, do you think it's appropriate for STEM instructors to reveal their identity? So I want you to think to yourself, what % of students do you think thought it was appropriate for an instructor to come out? And then go ahead and put your ideas in the chat, and then we'll do one final kind of chat blast. What percentage of students thinks that it's appropriate for STEM instructors to reveal that they're a member of the LGBTQ+ community? All right, do you have your percentages there? Go ahead and chat blast. All right, so I'm seeing 50, 70, 80, 80, 95. Okay, so what do we actually find? So 95% of all students agreed that it would be appropriate for a STEM instructor to come out in class. So we were blown away by this finding. And we found that this was really, really encouraging because it actually meant that a lot of the concerns that those students and instructors had in those first two studies that I presented were kind of ill-founded, that they thought that it was inappropriate, but actually the majority of students actually thought that it was appropriate for a STEM instructor to reveal their identity in class. And why? We coded the open-ended responses and they said it empowers the LGBTQ community. It's a way to get to know the instructor, and it's an important part of the instructor's identity, right? And so by having that instructor silence themselves and not actually share that part of their identity, that was actually deemed to be inappropriate, as opposed to actually sharing that they're a member of the LGBTQ community. So takeaways from this: less than a 5-second intervention of an instructor coming out positively impacted most students in the class and disproportionately impacted women and LGBTQ students. 95% of all students agreed that it's appropriate for instructors to reveal their LGBTQ identities in the class. But I want to highlight, this was one study, one instructor, one institution, right? So if you're skeptical, you should be, right? Because there's so many different factors that could influence some of these outcomes. So we're actually in the process of replicating the study at a national level, and I'll actually end my kind of final slide in the talk and talk about that. Now, before I do that, my final section that I want to talk about is coming out to students is a deeply personal decision influenced by lots of factors. I'm certainly not advocating for every person to come out. For some people, coming out is a process that has to happen over multiple years. Also, we don't just come out once. So, you have to often come out again and again. And so I'm not at all advocating for every LGBTQ individual to come out to students. I'm just advocating for LGBTQ individuals to think about the potential benefit that that decision could be for students, and then to factor that into their consideration. For a lot of those LGBTQ instructors, they weren't thinking about the possible benefits. The costs weren't that much, but they just didn't think about the benefits. Now, if you're not a member of the LGBTQ community, you might think, well, what can I do, right? I'm obviously not able to reveal that I'm a member of the LGBTQ community if I'm not that, right? So how do we create more inclusive spaces for individuals? And a group of us within the SABR community, the Society for Advancement of Biology Education community, wrote an essay focused on creating more inclusive academic biology spaces for LGBTQ individuals. but it's applicable really beyond just biology to STEM across the board. And so we published this paper in July of 2020, and I'm going to go through some of the recommendations to kind of close out my talk. So first, be thoughtful about the language used regarding the LGBTQ community. So learn what the acronym stands for. Don't say that there's too many letters to remember. That actually is offensive to do that. And use the term appropriately. It's really important to consider that terms change over time, and terms that were appropriate in the 80s are no longer deemed appropriate. Further, there's actually words that have been reclaimed that used to be slurs, right? So queer is actually a really good example of a word that has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community. Learn the specific vocabulary around the LGBTQ community. In this article, we actually have a whole vocabulary section of terms that may not be familiar to you, but just skimming through and starting to become more aware of these terms could help you make your class more inclusive for LGBTQ students. Create opportunities for people to describe who they are and avoid assuming people's identities, names, and pronouns, right? Zoom makes this really great. If we can change our name, we can put our pronouns behind our name, and individuals, whether they're cisgender or transgender or non-binary, can choose to put their names there to normalize that process of having pronouns explicit. In an in-person class, I often use name tents, and I ask students if they're comfortable to be able to put their pronouns on that. I don't force them to do it because some students may actually be in the process of trying to figure out what those pronouns are, and actually labeling themselves with one of those pronouns could be triggering for them. Careful that you don't assume the gender or partner preference of individuals. If you're having some kind of event, careful that you don't just assume that everyone is straight. Foster safe environments for individuals to be able to reveal their LGBTQ identity, and it doesn't have to be this huge thing and a huge burden for people to come out. Meaningfully advocate for the LGBTQ community. So if you make a mistake, if you misgender someone, if you don't provide non-binary option when you did a survey, you can view those mistakes as learning opportunities. The next time you create a survey, you can have a non-binary option. If you make a mistake and misgender someone, don't make a huge deal about misgendering, just apologize and get it right the next time, right? You can overtly support the LGBTQ community. You can familiarize yourself with LGBTQ community and campus resources. Some campuses have safe zone trainings that you can participate in. And then you often get a flyer that you can put up on your door to indicate you're a safe space for LGBTQ individuals. So that's something you can do. And then specifically, if you teach biology, there's ways in which the LGBTQ identity intersects with the biology curriculum, thinking about mating and genetics and evolution. And so, you can think about actually discussing the full range of gender and sexuality in biology classes. You can think about incorporating positive examples of LGBTQ and identity into the curriculum, as opposed to just highlighting LGBTQ individuals when you're talking about the context of HIV and AIDS, which often gets done in textbooks and in science courses. You can present LGBTQ role models in science. For those of you who are familiar with Scientist Spotlights, this is an initiative run by Jeff Shinsky and Kimberly Tanner, and they highlight how important it is to highlight role models for lots of different types of role models in the classroom, and they have some examples of LGBTQ instructors in their data set. And be thoughtful about the use of humor and pop culture, that you're not inadvertently offending someone. And then if you do research, think about how you're conducting research in ways that are inclusive of the LGBTQ community. Something that I try to use is they as a singular pronoun, and often I get copy editors that try to change it back to he or she, and I try to advocate that actually they is a recognized singular pronoun that is actually inclusive of non-binary individuals. So with that said, I want to thank the folks who are involved in this work. This has been primarily a collaboration with Dr. Caitlin Cooper, who's an assistant professor at Arizona State University. And some of the work was done in collaboration with Kara Gomali, Kay Cipriya, and then our grad student, Carly Bush. And I want to call out the folks who were involved in writing that 14 recommendations article. And then finally, that one study we only have done in one context with one instructors, and we're super proud of the fact that we got awarded an NSF grant to do this at scale. So if you are an LGBTQ SIM instructor or a graduate student, or if you know someone who might be interested, please email me and we can be in touch. We have funding, stipends to be able to basically pay instructors to come out or not come out in their classroom and look at the impact on students. And with that, here are the articles that I presented, and I'll take any questions. And feel free to add the questions either in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can just do it verbally, whatever you're most comfortable with.
I have a question. Can I just start?
Yeah.
I was wondering whether the course where the instructor outed themselves with a slide, whether that was an active learning course or not, and how that might intersect with the stuff that you presented in the first half.
Yeah, so it's actually the same course as the very first study, but in the first study, that instructor didn't actually reveal their LGBTQ identity to the class, and then started revealing it, and so then looked at the impact. So very similar class, large enrollment class, but active learning class. But that's an interesting question, right? Does it matter more in an active learning class versus a traditional lecture class, right? Where you're interacting far more with the instructor, so actually getting to know the instructor more as a person could matter, right? A lot of our work that we've done looking at those increased interactions in active learning classes have focused on the interactions between students, but there's also increased interactions between the instructor and students. So maybe that relationship becomes far more important in those classes as well.
Yeah, exactly. And then similarly, like if the instructor is setting the stage at session number 1, outing themselves, then maybe the student-student interactions at the later active learning kind of group works might be more comfortable for students.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And we haven't studied that explicitly, but I think that that's a great prediction.
Thanks. This was really interesting.
I have another question. I have one that's about kind of the methodology, another one that's more practical. I'll start with the practical one. One of the things I've been thinking about as we think about pronouns is that I wonder if using they is actually not as inclusive as we want it to be, and whether can we do something that's like he, she, they, or is that just like impractical because it's too much? Or is there another word for that? And maybe it's not so much about like what to do now, but maybe about like where we might be in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there was a movement, and I don't know enough about it as far as being able to pinpoint it, but before they became kind of the singular they became approved, people were advocating for other non-binary pronouns. It would be like a different one, like ZE was a pronoun that people were trying to advocate for using, and then people just couldn't use it. Like it was just mind-blowing because it was not what we're normally used to, etc. So I think my handle on it, but I'm far from an expert on this, and so other people are, if anyone else knows more about this, feel free to chime in. But I think that people have fallen back on using the word they because that is a normal word that we would use in just our normal vernacular, and so that way we can be inclusive of non-binary individuals, right, while still while not coming up with a whole new term. But yeah, and I think that I think at least when I'm writing papers, I think that I'm comfortable using they as a singular pronoun because I feel like it that becomes inclusive. That they could be a he, or it could be he, she, or they, right? And that kind of collapses it. But I don't know. Someone might think differently. So, and then your methodological question.
Yeah, I was interested in the analysis you did on the students who disproportionately were benefited from when the professor shared their identity. And one of the things I was thinking about was, I wonder, was it a principal component analysis, and what factors were entered in that analysis? When you showed just like, I think 10-ish factors, were those just a subset within the factors that were entered into the analysis?
That's a good question. So it wasn't a principal components analysis, but I would have to go back to the paper and Carly, who's the grad student who actually ran those. I don't actually remember exactly what we did with that. So sorry, I can't answer that question. But it wasn't a principal component analysis, I don't think.
Any other questions that people want to ask, either just Oh yeah, Deborah, do you have a question?
I can ask one. Sara, that was great. I loved your work. Fantastic job. I have a couple of different questions. I was wondering, I noticed on, I can't remember which construct it was, but on one of the figures, the Muslim student population did seem to increase significantly. And then across the board, that student population in particular seemed to have a lot of variation. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
So sample size was low. We don't have a lot of Muslim students in Arizona. And we don't have a good rationale for why that might actually be the case. I mean, we were predicting that they would look very similar to the Christian students. So I think just more work needs to be done thinking about that.
Okay, curious. The second question I had, the target class here was an upper division class, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think the results would differ if you sort of looked at the ontogeny of student responses, you know, from freshman bio to some of the senior seminar type classes?
Yeah, so meaning in terms of the impact of an instructor coming out on students. So yeah, I think that would be really interesting. I would predict that you might have more students in their very first year that are more resistant to instructors revealing their identity. But yeah, I mean, so part of what we would want to do with this national study is to get instructors coming out at, you know, look at intro courses, look at upper level courses and see. A lot of, I mean, most of these students, we did collect these data, had never had a STEM instructor come out before. I think that it's an interesting question of, well, if more LGBTQ instructors are hired and more LGBTQ instructors come out, does there at some point become a diminishing return on this, right? Like, it doesn't become less exciting for these students, for the instructor to come out, right? And, you know, in some ways, like, I think that would actually be a really great thing, right? That it just becomes like, oh yeah, like that professor is a member of the LGBTQ community. But that also is something that we don't know, and that could be interesting to look at. And you know, there's so many things. So, you know, I do want to encourage caution in some of the findings from the last study, just because we know that there's so many things that are impacting, you know, perceptions of instructor approachability, right? Whether it's just, you know, whether it's how the instructor relates to students, whether it's their gender, whether it's their height, whether it's their perceived attractiveness, right? There's like all kinds of other things that could be at play here. So, so that's why we really need to do this national study.
Thank you. Great job again.
I'm seeing a question in the chat. Have you followed up with the LGBTQ students who had a professor either came out and made sincere, significant effort to welcome them at classes, how they have done in other classes or job prospects? How long lasting was this experience in helping LGBTQ students stay in STEM? So that is a fantastic question. And I just had a meeting with my grad student today to finalize the interview script that we're going to use to get, yeah, what is the impact for students who have had an experience of an instructor coming out, and actually dig into it deeply and see, does it last beyond the course, right? Does it have more longer term impacts? Do they build any kind of real relationship with that instructor, et cetera? So that is highly timely, and that's something that we're planning on conducting this semester.
I can go ahead. I had my hand up. Kind of going off of the second to last question, where you mentioned that you might expect that sort of student comfort with revealing identities might differ early in their college career versus later. In the data where you've looked at like revealing concealable identities in active learning environments, is there a difference in early career versus later career students and sort of how comfortable they are revealing their own identities?
I'm trying to think if I don't know of any data that specifically looked at that across year, which I think would be really interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
Cool.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. We do have ongoing work. So my colleague, Caitlin Cooper, is focused on mental health and anxiety and depression. And she's really interested in instructors revealing anxiety and depression and how does that impact students. And she is doing, so I was trying to think through some of her recent work looking at students with anxiety and depression, but I don't think she's looked at it across year in school.
Cool, thanks. And thanks for the great talk.
Thank you.
If there aren't any other questions, let me share one more time. If you could let us know you're here. And also just wanted to let you know that the next time that we're meeting, we're going to have David Asai from HHMI. He's the Senior Director for Science Education at the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, coming to help us think about how we can be a more inclusive environment at UCI. So definitely come back next month for that. At this one, I thought we could kind of transition into talking more informally about things that maybe Dr. Brownell didn't actually get to talk to during her talk, but you've been curious about, and just kind of either getting advice about whatever, whether it's like career things or whether it's just like, hey, I have this issue with my classroom. What can I do about that? So if any of you would like to stay for that, like, let's go ahead and start that more informal conversation. Let's see. I guess, Abby, did you want to start off sharing a little bit? If you want, so just as a reminder, these sessions are recorded, so go ahead. Oh, there's our emergency alert that I think everyone's getting on our phones. But these are recorded, so keep that in mind. But otherwise, if you're willing, kind of share a little bit about yourself and then maybe share like whatever question you want to talk about.
So can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. I'm using my headphones. So hi, everyone. Fantastic talk, Dr. Brownell. Sorry, how do you pronounce your last name?
Just Brownell.
Brownell, thank you. Sorry, I
Brownell,
was like, so fantastic talk. And I really appreciated that you included like, hey, even if you don't identify in the LGBTQT community, like, hey, here are things that you can do to be an ally and also to maybe incorporate in your own lesson plans in your own classroom. One of my questions I had to ask you was, how did you come upon this research? I saw that you originally were in neuroscience and now you're focusing more on like these kind of issues. I was wondering, like, how did you make that transition?
Yeah,
I'm on the crossroads of like, okay, like how much neuroscience research do I want to do, like educational research, being an educator. So like, I'd love to know how you came to be in your position right now.
Yeah, so I didn't know that this field existed. I identify as a discipline-based education researcher. I didn't know that that existed when I was an undergrad. I was a biology major. I like tutored. I was a TA. I love teaching. And I was like, I think I want to teach at the college level. And so I thought that the only route forward was to get a PhD in biology, right? And so my interest was in neuroscience. So I ended up doing a PhD in neuroscience. And I liked it, but I will say that I didn't love it. And I was pretty convinced during grad school that I was pretty bad at research, actually. And it was this thing that like I would have to psych myself up to like do. And I loved mentoring undergrads in my research lab. I loved going to conferences and presenting my work, but like the day-to-day grind of research, I just didn't like it that much. And so originally I really was like, okay, I think I want to be a lecturer, teaching exclusively and not doing research. And then as I started teaching, I went through this kind of evolution of teaching that I think a lot of people experience, where I had no idea what I was doing. And then I started to feel like I knew what I was doing. And then I was like, oh, I'm making people laugh. Like, I'm a great teacher, right? And then like, I realized, well, actually, like, I have no idea what they're actually learning, what they're thinking. Like, there's so much that I don't know. And then I was like, I want to get more of like an academic foundation to teaching. Like, are there like, but it was so interesting. Like there was this moment that I was like, are there even classes on this? Like, can I like learn like how to teach better? And there is, right? There's like a whole like school of education, right? And like education course. And so I started taking, like, I actually walked over to the School of Education at my institution and started talking to science education researchers there. And through that and through a series of kind of random emails off to people, including one to Kimberly Tanner, just random email that was like, hey, I've heard that you maybe do what I'm like potentially interested in by doing research on the undergraduate like biology education as opposed to K through 12. And she responded and I set up a meeting with her. And that one meeting totally changed my life. That it was just, she was like, here are all the journals and here are things to read. And here's this whole career that you could do. But it's not, you know, if you like teaching, that's one thing, but you actually need to get involved in education research if you think that education research is something that you want to do. And so I came back to my institution and luckily kind of got involved in a project assessing biology lab courses. And that actually happened to be one of the first course-based undergraduate research experiences that it was developed. I didn't even know what cures were at the time. That term cure didn't even exist at the time. And so that's how I started doing education research. And I realized that actually I wasn't bad at research. I like love research, and it was just the type of research that I was doing. And the education research was just far more interesting and exciting. And I liked the more social aspect of it. And the questions were questions that I wanted to just like talk to my friends about. Like, I just wanted to like read every article and like, I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. So I ended up finishing my PhD in neuroscience, and I kept that kind of separate. But on the side, I basically started doing education research and fell in love with that and decided to then transition afterwards. And I did 2 short postdocs in biology education or science education. And then I got hired into my current position where I'm in a biology department, and I was on a tenure track path where I teach biology courses, but then I exclusively do biology education research. So it was kind of a meandering path from the beginning, but it was, I mean, if anyone's interested in this as a path, you know, and I'm happy to chat offline more about it. I feel like I was really privileged that other people like gave me advice at critical points along the way. So I feel like I have to kind of pass that on. And it was really reassuring to me that like, I had in my mind that like research wasn't what I like to do. And it was just the type of research, because now I still love teaching and I still take great pride in my teaching, but I would say that I love research actually more than teaching now. And I can't imagine a job that would have been kind of as perfect for me as a job where I get to both teach and do research and have kind of both of the benefits of that. And then specifically in terms of how I got interested in this type of research. So at the beginning, I was just interested in broadly improving undergraduate biology education. I was interested in just kind of anything related to that. And then over time, I just get more and more interested in I think I just realized how important inclusion was, and diversity and equity and inclusion, and specifically for stuff with LGBTQ individuals. So I identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, so it has a personal like relevance for me. And then it just became clear that, you know, doing this work has such potential benefit to students. And, you know, and at the time I was starting to do this work, there wasn't a whole lot of work on that. It was, we were looking at the impact of active learning just across the board on all students, right? And we weren't looking at how it was differentially affecting certain populations of students. And so thinking about just trying to create more inclusive spaces, we have to think about all student identities. So some identities that I hold, but some identities that I don't hold, right? And and so I think about this both in my teaching and my research is how can we make sure that we are able to kind of support and respect all students in the class for their respective identities, right? So
I'm just taking a lot of, no, thank you so much for being like so open to sharing like your journey, but also why you have such passion in this research. And so I'm just like writing down notes, and if it's totally okay, I can also would love to have your email address and continue to chat with you offline.
And I'll go ahead and put my email in the chat. It was on the last slide, but
I think one thing that stood out also in like your past is that you did 2 really short teaching postdocs, and thought it might be helpful, like how did you get to like really maximize those really short postdocs. I mean, I think most people in biology are used to like postdocs are much longer. So
Yeah.
how did you like utilize those such short postdocs to like go to where you are today?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I didn't really have a choice in that because that was really the funding at the time. So when I finished my PhD, I actually decided to stay on at my institution as a lecturer for a year and a half. So I got hired on and at my institution, lecturers were not faculty, they were considered staff. And so I actually had that experience of being a lecturer, which that feeling of being kind of a second class citizen very much made me decide to go on and try to pursue a tenure track path because I felt firsthand kind of how negative those situations can be. And this is dependent on the institution, but at my institution, lecturers were for sure not treated very well. And so this was in the Bay Area. And so Kimberly Tanner was basically up the road 40 minutes. And so I wasn't teaching in the summer. And so she had a little bit of grant funding. So we were able to kind of carve out a postdoc project where I like was full-time there for the summer and then kind of did it half, part-time during the academic year. And, I have to say that like, I'm grateful. I've had many, many really positive, amazing mentors in my life, but I mean, Kimberly taught me almost everything in terms of how I think about mentoring, how I think about teaching inclusively, how I think about, research and focusing my research on inclusion. That like 6-month period where I was mentored by her was the most transformational that I've ever had. So anyway, so that was my kind of first part of that. And I just tried to soak up as much as possible. Right. So I would try to get there early and, every 5 minutes that I could get with her, like I would try to like grab that. If she was going to go have lunch, like I tried to like walk with her to lunch so I could like pick her brain about something. Right. And I think that I would really encourage, trainees to think about that. Right. Like, trying to just maximize the opportunities and just learn as much as possible from people. And I try to do that. And I'm internally grateful for just her advice and challenging assumptions that I had, right? Like I came there and I was like, yeah, I'm a pretty good teacher. She's like, prove it to me. And I showed her my teaching evaluations and she's like, these don't really say anything. They just kind of say that you're kind of nice and funny. And she's like, you need more substance there. And so it made me really rethink like, okay, well, how am I creating inclusive teaching spaces? And, what do I need to do differently? And so again, just very grateful. And then I ended up getting a postdoc at University of Washington with another 3 sets of fantastic mentors, Scott Freeman, Mary Pat Windroff, and Allison Crow. And they just had funding for a year. So I would have stayed longer, but we just had kind of a year of funding from the department to basically do work centered around the core concepts of biology. And so I started working with them and again, just learned a ton about how to work through projects and how to interact at like a departmental level through stuff. And that experience was actually really positive. I was worried at first having like 3 different mentors, but I got something different out of each one. I know sometimes co-mentoring relationships don't work out, but for me, it just worked so well because I was able to actually kind of maximize what I got from each person. And I got very different things from each person. And I mean, all 3 of them still remain to this day mentors that I'll go to for different purposes, right? And I'm grateful that I have 3 people who I can go to as opposed to just 1. And then I will say, and then to be just very transparent, like I was also lucky in that it was the right time to want to apply for a tenure track position in biology education research. The papers that I had when I applied for my job, I don't think if I had that same collection of papers now applying for a job, I'm not sure I would be hired, right? Because like the field has grown so much, like the research is so much better at this point and the candidates are just so much better, right? So in some ways I was also lucky in that I was able to, so specifically the question about those 2 short postdocs, I think I was able to leverage those 2 short postdocs because the field was so new and people were getting hired into these positions with no publications in biology education research, and that's not happening now. So the field has matured a lot in the last 8 to 9 years. And that doesn't mean, so anyone that's listening, that doesn't mean just because if you don't have biology education research publications right now, that doesn't mean you can't go into that field. It means you're probably not going to get away with a 6-month postdoc.
Sorry, everyone, I have to run. I guess I'm actually running my experiment right now, but thank you so much for the talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for also like organizing this talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us. Allie and Sydney, did you want to chat about something?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I'm just listening. I was doing some other stuff in the background. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Cool.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'll go ahead and end the recording now.